What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Wednesday, July 10th edition of the Ship My Money Show, First Look Edition. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. We have a 10-game MLB slate today. We don't appear, at least right now, to have the same level of weather concerns that we did last night. That slate sucked. I ended up basically removing the Reds from my player pool because of the weather. That obviously went really poorly. Also removed Lodolo, which went better, but pretty difficult to win without the 2K guy that scored 800 fantasy points. Didn't have him, so that kind of ruined my night on what I think otherwise would have been a pretty good slate. Had a lot of Boston, had a lot of Oakland, was getting to them all day. So that was frustrating, but we don't have much weather to worry about right now, it looks like. There's a couple spots that, maybe stuff pops up by the time we get to lock. It is summer. It is still really hot everywhere. So don't just ignore the weather, but looks much better today than it did yesterday. Pitching today looks pretty ugly for the most part. So obviously we'll be diving into that and how to approach that on this show. Going to go game by game as always. If you're trying to follow along or if you're watching this later on in the day, as a reminder, you can see where I'm at by which game is filtered up here at in the banner at the top. As always, give a thumbs up to the show, subscribe to the channel, like the show. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. Also doing generally 2 shows a day now, so subscribing to the channel will let you know when that second show is starting as well. And if you're interested in more intermediate and higher level strategy stuff, check out the link in the description below for Endgame Syndicate. That's the new site that I've started with Uticow, Brick75, and Nerdy Tenor, doing DFS training videos, hanging out in Discord, giving higher level strategy advice, helping you get better so that you're less reliant on other people and can make some money on your own more consistently and more sustainably. That's a thing that I've always enjoyed doing, and we went ahead and started that site. So check that out if you haven't already. We all approach DFS pretty differently. So no matter how you view it, you'll probably find somebody that communicates on the same level as you, is looking at the same things as you are. So pretty excited about that. Looking forward to growing that as we go forward. Now diving into the first game on tonight's slate, Los Angeles Dodgers taking on the Philadelphia Phillies in Philadelphia. Pretty high implied run total, or pretty high total in this game. 2 very good offenses. Christopher Sanchez going for the Phillies. He's been very, very good at preventing runs this season. He did finally give up a couple of home runs, and I believe it was his most recent start, but still only at 0.18 home runs allowed per 9 this year, 3.12 xFIP. He's obviously going to give up more home runs going forward. It's just completely unsustainable to never give up home runs, but he has been good at limiting power. Sub 100 expected ISO against left-handed hitters, 101 expected ISO against right-handed hitters. Not a great strikeout pitcher, though, and he is 9K here in a tough matchup with the Dodgers. So I think he's going to be very, very difficult to get to from a DFS standpoint. That's reflected in the ownership here. You can see he's not showing up as optimal all that often for me either. Same goes for Gavin Stone on the other side. I have no idea how this guy gets a $9,300 price tag ever, but especially in a matchup against the Phillies in Philadelphia. Stone this year only striking out about 19% of hitters, 4.13 xFIP. So even easier, I think, to write off than Sanchez is at that price tag. I don't know how you even justify a price tag, a $9,300 price tag for Stone against basically anybody, much less the Phillies. So moving on from the pitching here, you do have 2 good offenses in a good hitter's park. The Phillies offense is closer to full strength now. They got Schwarber and Harper back yesterday. So that lineup is just going to be more appealing to get to going forward than it had been for the last couple of weeks. Gavin Stone so far this year has allowed basically no power to lefties, sub 100 expected ISO. He has a changeup. He throws 37% of the time. That's his most utilized pitch against left-handed hitters. So it's not very surprising to see reverse splits for him. Generally, if you're going to have sustainable reverse splits for a right-handed pitcher, it's going to be somebody that has a good changeup. Sometimes you'll see it be a curveball, but usually it's going to be a good changeup or a good splitter that they can utilize against those opposite-handed hitters. That's a pitch that does generally play better against opposite-handed hitters as opposed to same-handed hitters. That's not to say you can't play Schwarber or Harper. Obviously, they are very, very good. They are reasonably priced here also, 5,500 and 5,600. These are guys that at times are north of 6K. They obviously give you very, very high ceilings. They are getting a little bit of ownership here, like 8 to 10% between the 2 of them. They look fine if you can afford them. He does, Stone, that is, does give up a bit more power to righties, 167 expected ISO there. So again, not giving up a ton of power to either side of the plate, just not getting strikeouts. So it's a high upside Philadelphia offense just because of their talent level. They don't look like a priority stack because they are pretty expensive. Stone doesn't give up a ton of power, but from a talent standpoint, at modest ownership, they certainly look fine in tournaments, especially your larger field tournaments. The Dodgers basically in the same boat. You can see showing up as a middle of the road stack here. As I mentioned before, Christopher Sanchez just does not give up power, but that doesn't mean that Shohei Ohtani can't do damage or Will Smith can't do damage. The thing you have to keep in mind when you look at a pitcher like Sanchez and look at how good he's been at preventing power so far this season, in addition to keeping in mind that he's going to give up more from this point on than he has to this point just because he has to. But if he were facing Ohtani and Smith and Teoscar Hernandez and Freeman, if he were facing them every single day, his power numbers would just be higher than they are. So obviously it is still a high upside spot for the Dodgers just because of who is in their lineup. But the matchup against Sanchez does make things difficult. It is why you aren't seeing much ownership coming into them, in addition to the fact that they're expensive. The other problem with the Dodgers from a stacking standpoint is the guys you really want to get to are expensive at the top. Smith, Ohtani, Hernandez, Freeman, the guys I already named. You can stack them with value from the bottom of the order. The problem is twofold, though. One, those guys aren't actually that good. But two, and probably really the bigger issue is there's so much pinch hit risk with this team. Like if Chris Taylor starts this game, yeah, he's 2,800, second base, third base. He's an easy way to afford those guys at the top of the order, but he's probably going to get pinch hit for once you get into the bullpen. So you're probably getting, 2, maybe 3 at bats from Chris Taylor before he turns into, say, Gavin Lux when a right-handed reliever comes in. Andy Pagas, not as much pinch hit risk, but it's still there, especially with James Outman active for this team. If Outman's not in the starting lineup, one of Pagas or Vargas is probably getting pinch hit for later in the game. So there is pinch hit risk in the non-studs in this lineup, and paying attention to who exactly is not in the starting lineup dictates exactly how much pinch hit risk there is. For example, if Gavin Lux starts, obviously he's not pinch hitting for Chris Taylor, but assuming he's not starting, he probably will. Same goes for Outman. If you get a starting lineup where you have Pagas and Outman in there and Miguel Vargas didn't start, there's no reason to expect Vargas to pinch hit for Pagas. But if Outman isn't starting, then he's probably going to. So keep an eye on that. That is something to keep in mind if you are trying to full stack the Dodgers. Next, we have the A's taking on the Red Sox in Fenway. This game did not disappoint yesterday. 12-9 final in that one. A lot of run scoring, a lot of fantasy production, and somehow a good start from Brian Bayo as well. Today, we have Nick Pivetta taking on JP Sears. Nick Pivetta looks great. He is expensive at 9,600. This park in this summer weather is still a very favorable hitter's park. Pivetta is somebody that gives up power. The A's do have power. So all of that stuff is concerning, but there's not a lot of pitching talent on this slate in general. And Pivetta is not only one of your best strikeout pitchers with a 28% strikeout percentage, but he does also have one of the best strikeout matchups, as Oakland has the second, or they actually now have the highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. Or sorry, that was against left-handed pitching. They have the second highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this season behind Seattle at 27% on their active roster. So it's a spot where Pivetta still could give up home runs. That's something that he struggles with. It's a good hitting environment and a team with some power, but there's a ton of strikeout upside here as well. So you can see that I think he's going a little bit over-owned, or quite a bit over-owned, really, from an optimal standpoint versus ownership, showing up as optimal 15% of the time, getting about 29% ownership. But he is still one of the most likely pitchers to succeed, I think. I really like the upside that he gives you. And there are 10 games on the slate, so you're going to be able to find cheap bats that allow you to afford him. I've said it a lot on shows in the past. I generally am going to be getting different with offenses as opposed to pitching. So I don't get too concerned when a pitcher is going a bit over-owned, especially in the morning, because things tend to change by lock anyway. Pivetta, certainly one of the higher strikeout upside guys on the slate. JP Sears on the other side, tough matchup at 6,500. Huge park downgrade for him going into Fenway. Obviously, it's a very good Red Sox offense. I'm not particularly interested in getting to Sears here. Offensively, the Red Sox are showing up as the third most utilized stack. Oakland is showing up second most. That's probably one reason that Pivetta's optimal percentage is as low as it is for me right now, is that the A's are actually showing up as a good stack to get to because they do have power, they are in a good park, and they're cheap. So when you get to these Oakland hitters, they work well in a variety of ways. You could full stack Oakland, and then you're just going to have loaded lineups around them where you have good secondary stacks, good one-offs, as good of pitching as you can get on the slate. And you're in a situation where if Oakland comes through, you have very high probability plays elsewhere. But also, they're going to fit really nicely into higher probability stacks. Like if you go to a team like Boston on the other side or like Cincinnati, you're going to be able, or even if you wanted to go to like the Dodgers or the Phillies, two high upside, expensive teams we already talked about, mixing in 2 or 3 of these A's bats is going to allow you to afford those hitters that you want from those teams. So I do think that the A's are interesting here. They look like they're going a little bit overlooked right now as well. I think that's going to be a really interesting talking point on my show later in the day at 5, where I'm specifically talking my tournament approach. I'll be interested to see what I'm getting to as far as Oakland versus Pivetta. But right now, I think there's a good chance that I just end up playing a lot of Pivetta and then in my non-Pivetta lineups having a ton of Oakland. Because it is a really big boom or bust spot for both sides of that matchup. Pivetta, a very good strikeout pitcher in a good strikeout matchup, also a pitcher that gives up power against a team that has power and is getting a substantial park bump going from Oakland to Fenway Park. 213 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters this year for Pivetta, 182 to lefties. Langoliers, Rooker, Geloff, these guys all have power. Soderstrom is really, really cheap, probably hitting in the middle of the order, and Duhar is cheap and is a right-handed bat that can do some damage. So there's just a lot to like from both sides. Also, Nick Pivetta not particularly good at holding runners or preventing stolen bases. So that opens the door for more upside for Oakland. Zach Geloff in particular benefits from that. So I like that aspect as well. I think this is just a really good game to be getting to either side. And I think it's a situation where there's not a right answer. Like if you're playing one lineup, obviously you have to choose a side. I think it's really just kind of figure out what fits best and what you're trying to do. Like if I were playing one lineup and I have another offense that I love, play that offense, play Pivetta, and hope that it's a Pivetta day. If you decide that you don't really like Boston, you don't really like Cincinnati, you're not really high on those offenses, or you are scared to play Pivetta, then just get to the A's against him, negatively correlate with a popular, volatile pitcher. I think that there's just very, very good approaches, whichever way you go. Boston, I think, requires less explanation. They just have a bunch of good hitters. They're in Fenway Park. They're going up against a pitcher in JP Sears that has allowed a 227 expected ISO, 2 right-handed hitters this year, only 127 to lefties, but still feel free to play Rafael Devers. You're going to have plenty of right-handed power. Tyler O'Neill, Connor Wong are the 2 that are probably going to stand out the most. Romy Gonzalez as a value play at 3,300. Second base shortstop's going to look pretty good as well. The only thing that I would mention as a negative for the Red Sox here is that depending on what this lineup looks like when it comes out, there is the potential for pinch hit risk later in the game. Like Rob Refsnyder, very likely to be pinch hit for by Willie or Abreu if Abreu's not in the lineup, or Yoshida if Yoshida's not in the lineup. Gonzalez, if Hamilton is not in the lineup, you are relatively likely to have Gonzalez get pinch hit for by Hamilton. If Hamilton does start, that does lower the pinch hit risk on Gonzalez. Jarren Duran should be any lefty that starts can be considered safe because they're starting against the lefty. But of the righties, like Tyler O'Neill is safe, Connor Wong is safe, Rafaela should not be getting pinch hit for most likely. But any other righty that starts does have pinch hit risk. So do keep that in mind, especially if they are really popular. Right now, you're not seeing a ton of ownership coming in here, but like 10, 11% ownership to Gonzalez. He's a good value, but that pinch hit risk, especially if Hamilton were to not be starting this game, would be a little bit scary. Stephen Leibowitz mentioned Westbrook could be playing. That's another guy that would have significant pinch hit risk. Like the projected lineup, let me see what the projected lineup that I used had. Like this projected lineup has Dominic Smith in. There's a good chance that you have Westbrook starting in place of Smith, but that would be another guy that is most likely coming out of the game as soon as you get into the Oakland bullpen. So there will be some pinch hit risk here for the platoon guys. But that aside, the Red Sox are going to look good, especially, the guys that are always in the lineup. Colorado taking on the Reds in Cincinnati. This game went nuts yesterday. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, I did not have it, unfortunately. Looks like a pretty appealing game to get to in a variety of ways today. Frankie Montas is pitching for Cincinnati. He has struggled overall this season, has, I think, been pitching a bit better lately, which isn't overly surprising. He missed most of last season with an injury, so just working his way back into shape. You've gotten at least 5 innings in 4 straight starts from him. He hasn't given up more than 3 earned runs in any of those starts. And this was a pitcher that previously in his career was pretty good when you go back to his days with Oakland. So I'm not mentioning how he's pitched recently because I think you should just generally be looking at 3 and 4 start sample sizes for pitchers and deciding that suddenly they're good. But I'm mentioning it for Frankie Montas because this is a pitcher that his baseline expectation is that he's a solid pitcher based on what we've seen from him in previous major league seasons. Then he basically misses one or almost 2 full seasons, comes back, really struggles out of the gate. Somebody like that, I think you can put a little bit of stock or at least take a little bit of interest when you see them start to rebound and pitch like a competent major league pitcher again. He's only 7K here. The park sucks. It's one of the best hitter parks in baseball, but the matchup against the Rockies is very, very good. Colorado 5th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, only an 85 WRC plus. They're getting out of Coors Field, so while it is still one of the best parks to hit in, it's technically a park downgrade for the Rockies. Pitches in Cincinnati move like they are supposed to, as opposed to Colorado, where everything's kind of flat. So it is still a park downgrade for the Rockies. Montas on a slate that does have pretty weak pitching in general is getting a lot of ownership at 30%. He's showing up as optimal 22% of the time for me. I think he looks like a good value. I don't mind getting to him. On the other side, Kyle Freeland, 5K, underpriced just because he's a starting pitcher at 5K. He does have a pretty decent matchup against the Reds. Ninth highest strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching on the Reds' active roster since the start of last year. 95 WRC plus. Freeland also does get the benefit of turning around Elly De La Cruz. So De La Cruz will be hitting from the right side instead of the left side. That is his weaker side. All of that said, Kyle Freeland is not very good. He's not a great strikeout pitcher. I do think on a weak pitching slate, if you are trying to get to, let's say you're trying to get to like the expensive Dodgers, you don't want to use those cheap pinch hit risk guys from the bottom of their order. Maybe roll the dice on a 2% owned Kyle Freeland and just hope that he has a good start against what will probably be a pretty popular Reds offense as well. So you get some negative correlation there. I think he's going under owned. I think he's underpriced. I still don't think he's a great play. Most of my lineups probably will not need to use Kyle Freeland, but I did want to point out that there are kind of some angles you can take to make a case for Kyle Freeland. Turning around De La Cruz, negatively correlating with the Reds, him being incredibly cheap on a slate where you don't have a lot of good pitching. But all of that said, still a low probability play, somebody that I doubt I actually need to get that much of. Offensively, the Reds are showing up as the most frequently used stack for me right now. That is not particularly surprising. Freeland doesn't miss a lot of bats. Against righties this year, a 178 expected ISO, 222 going back to last year in a much larger sample size. Lefties have a 141 expected ISO against him over that time. I'd be expecting to get to Cincinnati quite a bit here. Looking at the ownership for their hitters individually, they are popular. So as I mentioned, that is one small point in the favor of rolling the dice on Freeland potentially. But you will need to pay attention to what your red stacks look like. 10 to 15% ownership pretty much across the board. It's not a ton of ownership as far as raw ownership goes because there are 10 games on the slate, but it is enough where if you're full stacking the Reds, you're going to want to be getting to contrarian pitching, contrarian one-offs or mini stacks, but also it can be a very useful team to maybe 2 or 3-man stack with a lower owned primary stack and just hope that the Reds do damage, but it's 2 or 3 guys specifically against Freeland. That's an approach that I'll typically take pretty often when you see a team that is getting ownership top to bottom. Spencer Steer, Marte, India, if he's in the lineup, he was a late scratch yesterday. De La Cruz, Candelario, Stevenson, these guys all look pretty good. Blake Dunn comes with pinch hit risk. If he actually is projected for 15, 16% ownership, that's somebody that I'd be kind of hesitant to get to here because when you get into the bullpen, you could certainly see pinch hitters in place of him. The Reds do have outfielders that can sub in. Like if Will Benson is not in this starting lineup against the lefty, there's a good chance he's hitting for Dunn later in the game. Same can be said if you get Austin Slater in the starting lineup and Benson's not. Benson could certainly be subbing in. I don't actually know off the top of my head if Nick Martini is still on this roster, but that's another left-handed bat, potentially that could pinch hit for a right-handed platoon outfielder. I'm pulling that up now to double check. I don't know if he lost his spot when they got Slater or not. Looks like he is not on the active roster anymore, but you do have Will Benson is the guy that I would pay a lot of attention to. Like assuming Benson's not in the starting lineup and that you get one of Dunn or Slater, there's a good chance that that guy is not finishing the game and that they will be relatively popular because they're cheap and on Cincinnati. So do pay attention to that, especially if they are getting a lot of ownership. That aside, though, the Reds certainly look like a good stack here. They are mostly pretty affordable. The park is great. The matchup is good. The Rockies bullpen sucks and has been used lately. So all of that stuff works in their favor. Kyle Freeland is also surprisingly not very good at holding runners. So while De La Cruz does hit from the right side against him, which is a downgrade, it is a spot where I would still fully expect De La Cruz to be attempting to steal. Spencer Steer can run a bit as well. If India's in the lineup, so can he. So there is upside for the Reds from that angle also. For Colorado, clearly not as high a probability of success as Cincinnati. They have the lower implied run total. They have the more difficult matchup against Montas. But I think they are an interesting team in large field tournaments because of the ownership that Montas is getting and the fact that Montas isn't an elite pitcher, even if he is getting back into shape and pitching better than he was at the beginning of the year. Overall, he has still allowed a 230 expected ISO to lefties this year. But even beyond the specifics of Montas, it's just a situation where you have a 30% owned average, mediocre pitcher in Montas who's getting ownership just because of his price and because of a lack of alternatives on the slate. Those are the guys that generally I'm most interested in stacking against for ownership reasons. So then you look at Colorado and you don't have much ownership coming into their hitters individually. And then you also, if they do well, you're knocking off 30% of the field in addition to the percentage of the fields that don't have the Rockies. So in your larger field tournaments, I do think the Rockies make sense because of the added negative correlation with Montas. If you're playing smaller field, single entry stuff, less of a consideration, I think, just because you have less opponents that you need to beat. Washington taking on the Mets in New York. Tough park to hit in. We've had a lot of good hitters parks so far. This is not one of them. Luis Severino going for the Mets. Patrick Corbin for the Nats. No ownership coming into Corbin. He's 5,500. I think he's like a weaker version of Kyle Freeland, if that's possible. He is showing up as under-owned for me, but by even less than Freeland. Severino is the more interesting pitcher here. $7,500 price tag is reasonable for him. Good pitcher's park on a slate that has a lot of good hitters parks. The strikeout matchup with Washington is not ideal. Third lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 18.5%. 102 WRC plus. Severino himself only striking out about 18% of hitters. So pretty mediocre matchup, pretty mediocre pitcher. But again, that's kind of just what we have on this slate. He's getting 13%, 12 to 13% ownership. Showed up as optimal 13% of the time for me. He looks fine. I don't have any really interesting thoughts on him. He's just like a secondary SP2 option. Offensively, I wouldn't expect to get to the Nats too much. This park downplays power. The Nats don't have a ton of power anyway. Severino's not getting a ton of ownership like Montas is to make you want to stack against him. So I'm not all that interested in the Nats. If you get to CJ Abrams at low ownership, that's always fine. But the Mets are the more interesting team here going up against Corbin. Now, the park does still downplay power, which isn't ideal for stacking. But Corbin has allowed a 214 expected ISO to righties so far this year. You will have right-handed power in this Mets lineup. Pete Alonso, Francisco Lindor, JD Martinez, Mark Vientos, Francisco Alvarez. These guys can all do damage. You do have some potential pinch hit risk guys in Tyrone Taylor and Harrison Bader as well. So do be cautious of those guys. I'm double checking the Mets roster right now just to see what we're paying attention to as far as pinch hitters go. But decent chance that one of those guys ends up leaving the game. Ben Gamel, left-handed bat, likely on the bench here. DJ Stewart can pinch hit. They have Jeff McNeil, who is not in the projected lineup I used. So you do have pinch hit risk for the non-usual guys in this lineup. But Lindor, Martinez, Alonso, Alvarez, those guys all should be safe. Vientos, maybe. Like you could, if McNeil's not starting, you could see McNeil hit for him, but I don't think it's as big a priority as some of the other guys. Like Bader probably getting pinch hit for, unless the Mets are ahead, they'll leave him in for defense. Taylor probably getting pinch hit for against a righty. So Iglesias probably getting pinch hit for again, unless they're ahead, they'll leave him in for defense. So I think Iglesias and Bader, if the Mets have already done damage, they're probably safe. If it's a close game, they're probably coming out. So there is some pinch hit risk, but the main pieces of the Mets, you don't really have pinch hit risk because they're just going to hit against righties as well. So the Mets do look good. The only downside is that they are getting some ownership and they are in a park where it's tough to hit home runs. Obviously, home runs win you DFS tournaments. So that is something to keep in mind, even though the matchup against Corbin is very good. Kansas City taking on the St. Louis Cardinals. We have Michael Wacha for the Royals. We have Gordon Graceffo for the Cardinals. Ignore this ownership on Graceffo at 26%. SaberSim has an insane projection on him right now, and that's driving up the ownership projection. He most recently pitched 2 innings in his last start at AAA. Prior to that, he had made a relief appearance for the Cardinals. He did throw 67 pitches in that, and he has been starting at AAA. So I think he's relatively stretched out, but he's not somebody that I think is giving you, 100 pitches or anything. I would think that St. Louis is happy if you can get 4 to 5 innings from him. He's also not somebody that projects as a great strikeout pitcher, and he does have a tough strikeout matchup here against Kansas City. So I don't really know where that 16-point fantasy projection is coming from. I do think it comes down as the day goes on, and obviously when industry sites are lowering as their projections lower, the ownership projection is just going to come down because people using those projections are playing them less. So I don't think he gets in there around 25% of the time. He does maybe show up around 10%, which is fine. 7,300, if he gives you 5 innings, it probably means he's pitching pretty well. I would think he's probably throwing like 75, 80 pitches if he's pitching well. So I think he's okay, but certainly not as good as they have him projected at the moment. On the other side, Michael Wacha, a little surprised he's not getting more ownership. Maybe some of that has to do with the ownership that's projected for Graceffo right now, but 7,600, not a great matchup against the Cards, but they do rank 10th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, 111 WRC+. It is a favorable pitcher's park. Now, the caveat there is it does get hot and humid as hell in St. Louis this time of year, so the ball probably carries a little bit better than it should carry a little bit better than it does, earlier in the year. But that being said, I'm a little surprised. I just think he should be around 10% owned instead of 5%. He's not a great pitcher, but he does have a higher strikeout percentage, for example, than Luis Severino, better xFIP than Severino. He's been a better pitcher across the board than Severino. He has a better strikeout matchup than Severino. He's basically the same price as Severino, and he's getting like half to 1/3 the ownership. I don't mind him in tournaments. Again, it's not a ringing endorsement as far as I think Wacha is super likely to have a great game here. I don't think he's any less likely to have a great game than somebody like Luis Severino is that's getting more ownership, than somebody like Graceffo is, than even somebody like Montas. I would much rather play Montas. The matchup is obviously a lot better. But if you were to just give me 5-1 or 4 to 5-1 odds on Montas versus Wacha, I'm taking Wacha every single time there. If it's just that bet. Now, obviously, that's not exactly how you're making DFS lineups. But my point here is that I don't really know why Wacha is not getting a little bit more love when you have these other very, very suspect pitchers getting ownership. So that is an interesting spot I think to pay attention to. Maybe Wacha's ownership just comes up by lock. Offensively, I wouldn't anticipate getting to a lot of this game. It's just tough to target pitcher-friendly parks on this slate. I'm always happy to get to Bobby Witt Jr. Obviously comes with stolen base upside and a really good hitter on top of it. Getting about 7% ownership. Showed up as optimal, about 8% for me. But overall, this game's not getting much ownership, and I don't really think that it should. You do have some talented hitters, but neither of these pitchers are terrible, and the park is just difficult for hitting home runs. So I don't anticipate prioritizing it all that much. Before we get to Miami taking on the Astros in Houston, another reminder, if you haven't already, sign up for Endgame Syndicate using the link in the description below. Utical, Nerdy Tenor, Brick75, myself, talking intermediate and higher level DFS strategy, whether that is how to build your own projections. Brick has videos out on that already. I have gone step-by-step through the process that I go through to build and select lineups that I'm playing. Utical has done the same thing with, in his case, Fantasy Cruncher, in my case, SaberSim. So like I was saying before, if you're somebody that still uses optimizers, have you covered. Somebody that uses Sims and want to get better at using those, we have you covered. If you want to start building your own projections and don't really know where to start, we have you covered on that. Nerdy Tenors put together a bunch of very interesting series on strategy in general, on game theory, on breaking things down into smaller games so you can see the optimal ways to attack different portions of DFS. So a lot of strategy stuff, a lot of things that I think are very actionable in helping you get better very quickly. Check that out. Also, our Discord, obviously, we are around in there to talk. And we do also do a monthly Q&A roundtable live answering subscriber questions. So if you just have things that you want our opinions on, we're there for that as well. So check that out using the link in the description below. Sign up for that. Really excited about that going forward. Moving on to Miami and Houston. In Houston, the Astros, pretty big favorites here, as you would expect. Framber Valdez on the mound for Houston. Brian Hoeing is going for the Marlins. No ownership coming into Hoeing, and I don't really think that there should be. Not a good matchup against Houston. Very difficult team to strike out. He threw 46 pitches against the White Sox in 3 innings in his last start. I assume he probably can give you like 4 innings today, but I don't really see a reason to be getting to him against Houston at 6K. Framber Valdez, though, looks pretty good. 8,300, getting 32% ownership, showed up as optimal 21% of the time for me. His strikeout numbers are way down this year from last year, striking out only 19% of hitters, but he is still a good pitcher. 3.56 xFIP, good at limiting power, good at keeping the ball on the ground and getting soft contact. The Marlins active roster has an 86 WRC plus against left-handed pitching since the start of last year. They rank in the middle of the pack in strikeout percentage. This is just a spot where there have been a lot of slates this season where Valdez isn't that interesting because of the lack of strikeouts, but this just isn't one of them. For one, his salary is a lot lower than it would be if he were still striking guys out at the same rate that he did last year. So that's not as big of a consideration because the salary is already adjusted. And then also you just don't have a bunch of high strikeout guys that he's competing with on this slate. So you just have a very fairly priced, good pitcher against one of the weakest offenses on the slate. Love getting the Valdez here. He looks very good. Offensively, I don't really have interest in the Marlins. You can make the negative correlation argument against Valdez, but he's just not as volatile a pitcher as somebody like Frankie Montas. He is somebody that is actually good at pitching. We know he's good at pitching. He's been good at pitching for a very long time. The Marlins aren't good at hitting either. 130 expected ISO allowed to righties this year for Valdez, sub 100 to lefties. If you're going to Miami, it is purely because of the 30% ownership to Valdez. But again, if I'm looking for a low-owned team against a 30% owned pitcher, I would much rather be getting to Colorado in Great American Ballpark against Montas than Miami in Minute Maid against Valdez. Houston on the other side is more interesting going up against Hoeing. It's not the most appealing matchup just because you're probably getting one or two at-bats against Hoeing and then like one at-bat against a bunch of different relievers. That's not exactly what you like to get when you're stacking, but it is still a high upside offense against a not very good pitching staff in general. Yordan Alvarez, 5,600, 11% ownership. Great if you can get there. Still a favorable price tag on Bregman at 4,200. Altuve at 5,200 is fine. Gives you stolen base upside as well. And then you do get some value bats, which is nice. Loperfido, if he's in the lineup. Jake Myers, they're both cheap. Myers probably in a better batting spot than Loperfido, but obviously we don't have the lineup yet. Yainer Diaz at 4,400 is reasonably priced. Pena is reasonably priced. So you can, five-man stack this team pretty easily. Overall, they're showing up as a middle-of-the-road stack for me. I think the field is likely to get there a little bit more. Looking at five-mans, middle of the road there as well. Actually surprised to see how much the Dodgers are showing up as five-mans. I haven't looked at that before. But I think Houston is fine. I do think they're going a little bit over-owned, like I said. It is a good spot overall, but it's not the perfect spot because you are probably facing a different pitcher every time you come to the plate, with the exception of maybe getting to face Hoeing twice. Pittsburgh, nice park upgrade facing Milwaukee. They went nuts yesterday after a very slow start to that game. They ran out a really horrible lineup yesterday. It still did really well. Martin Perez and Tobias Myers pitching in this one. Myers getting some love at 7,700, 13% ownership, showed up as optimal 8% of the time for me. Certainly think he's another 7 to 8K pitcher that is perfectly fine. 21.5% K percentage, 4.08 xFIP so far this season. I'll also be interested to see what exactly the Pirates lineup looks like. O'Neal Cruz has been dealing with a hamstring injury, so whether or not he's in does impact exactly how potent the Pirates lineup looks. Myers has only struck lefties out 17% of the time this year, compared to a 25.5% strikeout percentage against right-handed hitters. The projected lineup for the Pirates is pretty balanced. Reynolds, Cruz, Tellez, Sawinski, Palacios, all from the left side. If you were to just get like a surprise right-handed hitter in there in place of, say, O'Neal Cruz, that would make things look a little bit better for Myers. But as is, just kind of looks like another completely mediocre guy in the mid-range that I don't really have a strong take on. Martin Perez at 5,800, another sub 6K pitcher that is technically under-owned, but that I also don't particularly want to be getting to. Tough matchup against the Brewers. Park downgrade, only striking out 17% of hitters this year. 4.42 xFIP isn't the end of the world, but tough to get excited about Martin Perez, especially in this park. The Brewers showing up as another middle-of-the-road stack against Perez. I kind of thought they'd look a little bit better, but they are a relatively expensive team. 199 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters by Perez so far this season. William Contreras, if you can afford him, looks good at 5,500, only getting 5 to 6% ownership. I do like the lack of ownership there. Willie Adames at 4,600 looks pretty good here with the platoon advantage. Hoskins at 4,200, I like. Now, this is another team that does have the ability to platoon pretty heavily facing a left-handed pitcher. So you will want to pay attention to the exact specific lineup that Milwaukee goes with. If, for example, Jake Bauers is not starting and Rhys Hoskins is, there is risk that Bauers ends up hitting for Hoskins. If Jackson Chourio is starting and Sal Frelick is not, there is risk that Frelick ends up hitting for for Chourio later on. So do pay attention to like what lefties are available on the bench and what righties are starting that those lefties could end up subbing in for. But it is a pretty decent spot for the Brewers, at least the Brewers, at the very least, the Brewers that aren't going to get pinch hit for Contreras, Adames, Yelich. And that's not to say, you can't play Hoskins or Chourio. It's just that they're a little bit riskier, but they are also cheap. So they can help you round out your stacks as well. Pittsburgh on the other side, perfectly fine matchup against Myers. Not a lights out pitcher by any stretch. Only a 144 expected ISO allowed to lefties this year. He has allowed a 224 expected ISO to righties. Does have the higher strikeout percentage there. So far, he's been much more boom or bust against right-handed hitters, while lefties are putting the ball in play, but they're not doing a lot of damage. If the Pirates have O'Neal Cruz, this lineup does look better, although he is expensive. At 5,100, it's tough to pay that. Tough to pay for Brian Reynolds. And you do have potentially some pinch hit risk here. Rowdy Tellez, 3,300. This is another spot where obviously he got there later in the game yesterday, and so did Palacios. So it's not always going to happen. But if you get a lineup where like Connor Joe isn't starting, the Brewers do have left-handed relievers in their bullpen that they can go to. Double checking who exactly is available, but I know generally they have 3 of them. They only used 1 of them yesterday, so they have 3 available lefty relievers that they could go to here to match up with Tellez, to match up with Palacios. So you do have potential pinch hit risk for the Pirates as well. This is a team that likes to platoon also. They do get a nice park upgrade, though, going into Milwaukee. Another good hitter's park here in Anaheim, Texas. Somewhat disappointing yesterday. Certainly didn't do what I would have liked them to. Going up against the Angels, Griffin Canning and Michael Lorenzen. 2 very mediocre pitchers in this one. Neither one's getting much ownership. Canning at 6,800, Lorenzen at 8,100. Lorenzen has the better matchup, but he is pretty expensive. I do think that you could use him in large field tournaments if, like, let's say you're going to a popular Reds team or something, and you have the salary to just go from Severino to Lorenzen as an example. Like, saving that ownership could make some sense just because he does have the good matchup. But he doesn't look that good at that price. He's not a great strikeout pitcher. He's only struck out 17.7% of hitters so far this season, 4.87 xFIP. Canning started out the season really, really slowly, has bounced back sort of at times, but overall still only a 15.8% strikeout percentage, 4.9 xFIP, and obviously a more difficult matchup against Texas. Neither of these guys look particularly useful to me. Offensively, Texas showing up as a top 5 stack for me. The Angels showing up further down the list. But the park is good. I like getting to Texas once again. Seager at shortstop, still very fairly priced at $5K. Nice salary gap between him and, for example, De La Cruz. So getting to Seager looks pretty good. He is getting a lot of ownership, though, getting basically double the ownership of De La Cruz, which, in tournaments does bump De La Cruz a little bit. Marcus Semien, strong second base play, even though he's not having a very good year so far. Josh Smith offers value with multi-position eligibility. Tavares at $3K, if you're stacking the Rangers, gives you some value. Jonah Heim was scratched yesterday. The lineup as a whole is more appealing if Jonah Heim is in because Andrew Kisner cannot hit, and he's the backup catcher. So the overall appeal, like the different ways that I would want to stack Texas, does increase if Heim is in the lineup. Adolis Garcia, not having a good year overall, has been struggling lately, but as a result, the salary's down. Did homer yesterday, which was nice. 4,500 looks pretty good for him. Lowe is cheap. Langford is cheap. So overall, a very nice combination of home run upside, stolen base upside, and power for this Texas team. I do like getting to them. Lorenzen is good at holding runners, good at preventing stolen bases. So that is a little bit of a downgrade for guys like Garcia, Wyatt Langford. But, overall, still a pretty decent spot for them, even though Lorenzen isn't the worst pitcher in the world. 174 expected ISO to righties. Or sorry, that's Canning. Canning is not the worst pitcher in the world, but 174 expected ISO to righties, 206 to lefties. Ignore what I said about Lorenzen holding runners. I flipped him to pitching for the Angels in my head because he used to. Canning, also decent at preventing stolen bases, not as good as Lorenzen. So, yeah, overall, I think a pretty solid spot for the Rangers. On the other side, for the Angels, I'm going to mess this up probably later in the day too, because I keep just picturing Lorenzen as an Angel. But on the other side, the more difficult matchup, Lorenzen is having a better year than Canning is. He is good at holding runners, as I mentioned. The Angels are cheap. They're in a good park. I think they're a fine contrarian stack, but they're not a team that I would be expecting to get to all that much. There's nothing that really stands out from the Angels lineup. 115 expected ISO to lefties for Lorenzen this year, 251 to righties. So, like, ideally, you get right-handed power. He's also only struck righties out 14% of the time compared to 21% of the time against lefties. But there's just not much of it in this lineup. Like, if you're looking for right-handed power, Brandon Drury, Taylor Ward, Logan O'Hoppe, like, they're all fine. Joe Adell has power if he makes contact, and you do have a pitcher that doesn't miss a lot of bats. So, like, there's that angle where, like, you could just play Drury, Ward, O'Hoppe, Adell, and then one other Angel, Neto, if you wanted to. They're cheap. They're in a good park. You get a bunch of really good players around them. Makes some sense, but overall, I think a pretty mediocre spot because overall those hitters aren't very good. Joey McHale said, "Thanks for the info. Can you do FanDuel picks too by a chance?" Pretty much anything I say is relevant to FanDuel. Baseball is not super price sensitive in the sense that, like, in NBA, a player being $500 different on one site than the other is going to change a lot of things. From an overarching standpoint, if it's a good matchup on DraftKings, it's a good matchup on FanDuel. The one thing that does obviously change is your SP2s. You don't need them on FanDuel. So, like, somebody like Frankie Montas is just not going to be as important on FanDuel because you can just, like, play Pivetta and you don't need Montas. I will, at the end of the show, click over to FanDuel and just take a quick look at their pitcher pricing because that's where things generally get the most different. But overall, like, if it's a good park, good matchup, all that stuff, it's applicable to both sites. Atlanta taking on the Diamondbacks in Arizona. Pretty high implied run total for Atlanta. Slade Ciccone on the mound for the Diamondbacks. Charlie Morton going for Atlanta. Morton is fine. It's not the best matchup against Arizona. They are a pretty difficult team to strike out. They do have good hitters in their lineup. They rank 20th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. 105 WRC plus. Charlie Morton, decent pitcher still at this point in his career. 24.2% K percentage is actually one of the highest strikeout percentages on this slate. It is behind Nick Pivetta, and that is it. Of the other pitchers today that have higher strikeout percentages, Tanner Bybee, Pablo Lopez, Michael King, Bailey Ober, Shota Imanaga, none of them are on this slate. So Morton does have the second highest strikeout percentage, 4.01 xFIP. He is a bit more expensive on DraftKings than a lot of the other, SP2 type options we're getting to. So that is keeping his ownership in check. He's just another guy that looks like he should be 10 to 15% owned. So yeah, he looks perfectly fine. Ciccone, 6,300, facing a watered down Atlanta lineup. Still don't particularly want to get to him. 18.9% K percentage, 4.49 xFIP this year. If you're playing the largest field tournaments and you need to punt SP2 and he shows up here and there, that's fine. It's not like I would be removing him if I happen to see a lineup with him, but I'm not going out of my way to get to Ciccone. The Braves do look pretty decent against him, showing up sixth most in all stack types and in 5-man stacks. He is a young pitcher, but still certainly has his share of issues. 225 expected ISO allowed to righties so far this year, 230 going back to last year. He has been a reverse splits guy. His slider gets hit pretty hard. His changeup does not, so that's why you see him struggle more with left-handed hitters than right-handed hitters. That's not to say you shouldn't play Matt Olson, but it is to say, or Ozzie Albies, but it is to say it sets up nicely as a good power spot for Austin Riley, Marcell Ozuna, Sean Murphy as a value option at catcher. So I do like that aspect that you have a pitcher that gives up a lot of power, doesn't miss a lot of bats, that has to deal with Riley, Ozuna, and Murphy. And then you can just throw in Olson, Kelnick, Albies, and you're still getting plenty of upside there. Albies and Kelnick give you stolen base upside as well. Ciccone, nothing. I don't have anything on him from a stolen base standpoint. So the Braves look like a pretty good stack here. I'm happy to get to them. My optimal percentages are pretty much in line with the ownership on Atlanta. On the other side for Arizona, they do have talent. They give you some power. They give you some stolen base upside, but it is one of the more difficult matchups on the slate with Charlie Morton. So I don't really want to go out of my way to target them. He does give up some stolen bases, but he's not horrible at holding runners. I would fully expect somebody like Corbin Carroll to be running, McCarthy if he's in the lineup to be running, but I don't think it's a situation where the whole team is just going to start stealing bases on Morton. So low owned, relatively high upside stack against a kind of popular pitcher. Maybe I get a little bit in tournaments, but they don't look like a priority for me. And then finally, Toronto facing the Giants in San Francisco. Big park downgrade for the Toronto offense, upgrade for their pitching. Chris Bassett facing Logan Webb. So two relatively talented pitchers here. Bassett getting 15% ownership, 15% chance of being optimal. Webb getting 13% ownership, 11% chance of being optimal. They just look like two more guys in that 10 to 15% ownership range and optimal range. They are perfectly fine. From a strikeout standpoint, Bassett has an 18% K percentage against lefties this year, 24% against righties. You'll probably get like 5 lefties in the lineup for San Francisco. So a pretty balanced lineup there. But again, the park downgrade downplays power. Bassett's given up virtually no power to righties, sub 100 expected ISO there, 197 to lefties. Again, the park just makes it so difficult to hit home runs that it's still not going to be that appealing getting to San Francisco bats against him. And it does just look like a pretty good spot for him at 8,500. I think he's pretty comparable to Charlie Morton. Logan Webb, if he were cheaper, would be really appealing here, but it's tough to pay $9,800 for him against a Toronto lineup that's very difficult to strike out, even though this park is good for pitching and Webb is a good pitcher. Toronto's active roster ranks 22nd in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. Webb himself has only struck out 21.2% of pitchers. So he's priced where he is because of his talent level at preventing runs. 3.11 xFIP on the season for Webb. But that doesn't really translate to a bunch of fantasy points. He is kind of, when we talked about Framber Valdez earlier, and I made the point that I don't really care about Valdez's lack of strikeouts because his salary has adjusted for it. Webb's hasn't. This is like if Framber Valdez was still priced priced solely looking at how good he is at preventing runs. So you're getting very similar pitchers in Webb and Valdez, but Webb is just way more expensive and has the more difficult matchup against Toronto because of the lack of good pitching on the slate and the fact that there is plenty of value bats, or are plenty of value bats rather. Webb, if you just have a lineup where you have the bats that you want, you have Frankie Montas, for example, and then you have $9,800 left over, then fine, click Logan Webb. He's a good pitcher. He probably won't get blown up. He'll probably give you a pretty good score, but the strikeouts are just really hard to come by for him, and that's why he's not a bigger priority on the slate at that price tag. So to recap, the top pitching for me right now on DraftKings, I like Nick Pivetta. Obviously, the ceiling is really high. Seems like I do also like Oakland, and maybe that's keeping Pivetta from being as optimal as the field thinks he is. But Frankie Montas, Framber Valdez, Chris Bassett, Nick Pivetta, my favorite pitchers here. Severino, Morton, Webb, I think all guys you can mix in as well. Pay attention to Michael Wacha's ownership. I think that there shouldn't be as big a gap between him and a lot of these other guys as there is. Offensively, a lot of stacks that look pretty similar. I don't think there was any one stack that it was just like, I love everything about it, but there were a lot that looked pretty good. Cincinnati, Boston, Texas, Atlanta. I think your like highest probability stacks, the Mets as well. But the thing that you don't like there is that they are in Citi Field, and there's a lot of good hitters parks on this slate. Oakland is like lower probability to succeed than most of those teams. Their matchup against Pivetta is not as good, but when they succeed, it looks really, really good because of that nice park upgrade and the fact that Pivetta gives up homers and they have power. They also negatively correlate with Pivetta. So again, I'll dive into that more on my show at 5 p.m., exactly how I'm handling Pivetta and Oakland, but just knowing how I play, I expect I get to a lot of Oakland here and a lot of Pivetta. But Oakland as a stack because they do counter Pivetta's ownership and they're in a really good hitting environment. I said I would flip over to FanDuel and look quickly at their pitcher pricing because obviously that is what changes the most. Also, like Stephen Leibowitz made the point in chat that FanDuel isn't as home run dependent. RBI and runs are weighted higher relative to DraftKings, or relative to home runs than they are on DraftKings. But still, it's so like a team like the Mets will probably look a little bit better on FanDuel because home runs don't matter as much. But generally, a good spot in baseball is going to be a good spot. Pitcher wise, we have Pivetta at 9K, definitely going to like that. Same things about Oakland apply though, that Pivetta is going to he's going to probably be the most popular pitcher, and he is a volatile pitcher in a tough pitcher's park. But I like Pivetta. Webb is really expensive on FanDuel too. If you can get there, great, but he is expensive. Bassett's pretty expensive. Big difference between Valdez's price on FanDuel versus DraftKings. He still looks fine on FanDuel at 9,800, but not the same sort of value play you're getting on DraftKings. Morton's comparable. Montas is comparable. Montas is obviously less useful on FanDuel just because you don't need an SP2. But yeah, pitching for the most part looks pretty similar. The big difference is that Valdez is at the same level of priority as on DraftKings just because you're only rostering one pitcher and he is way more expensive. That's all I have for you on this show. I will be back at 5 p.m. looking at DraftKings tournaments, specifically looking at how I'd be approaching and how I'd be playing it if the slate started right then. Same channel, 5 p.m. Eastern, so check that out. Have a good rest of your Wednesday afternoon.